All right. Welcome again, everyone, to the Fourth Generation Initiative and our second session of the Ideological College Uganda series, where we are thinking about, what is at stake in the 2026 general elections that will be in January, I believe. Campaigning is in earnest. There was a presidential debate that was held. And the president, who is the incumbent, did not show, but discussions were held, particularly among the main figures of the opposition. So the intervention of the Fourth Generation Initiative and the Ideological College series is to say, can we take a step back and start to think about, what actually we are going to the polls for? What is at stake? Can we understand our societies well enough to inform the decisions that we are making this year and for our future? And in the last conversation, we were, I believe, talking about the party, as a unit of analysis in our politics, considering the various formations that we have, what their interests are, what they represent, how they have evolved to be what they are today. We still believe strongly in the fourth generation platform that it's important for us to interrogate our politics seriously, right? So as to avoid errors, so as to act appropriately, so as to act in an informed manner, to transform society. When I started taking political education seriously, I remember I was introduced to the term pedestrian thinking, and somebody was trying to contrast between how a pedestrian, makes sense of events that are happening versus, how somebody who has had, a bigger consideration of the larger forces at work or at play. So those are just some of the things that inform the foundation. Today we will be thinking about class, right? Class as a concept of analysis in Uganda's politics. And again, I'm joined by Comrade Manzi, whom we are always glad to have. So when you famously, obviously, we all know the Communist Manifesto that Marx, penned with his friend Friedrich Engels in 1848, and how they open, that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And we're also aware of how much of an influence, Marxism and particularly scientific socialism has had on how, political actors on the African continent have conceived of politics, right? Whether that be the leaders of the immediate, post-independence national liberation movements, even various movements that have emerged to challenge the state, in the aftermath of attaining political independence. I think people like Sankara will be remembered for their deployment of Marxist Leninist tools. People like Museveni with their intellectual heritage, being at the University of Dar es Salaam, with that, leftist tendency. So you cannot take away the influence of particularly the Communist Manifesto and Marxist thought in how, even the way that it was domesticated and domiciled, right, and applied in Africa to sort of now make it, so we borrowed some of those tools to sort of make sense of our own reality. If you think about some of our foremost academics, some of our foremost, intellectuals, think about the Professor Naboderes, think about the Mahmoud Mamdani's, right? I believe Mamdani's graduate thesis was a class analysis or class formation in Uganda, and he tried to distill Uganda into various, classes and social classes. So I think as a way to begin the discussion, Manzi, do you think it's useful, the concept of class in trying to understand Ugandan society?
Simon. Certainly. Thank you, Olemo, for having me here again. I agree with the historicity of class in modern Africa's attempt to define herself and to locate herself within the broader global dynamics of how society and human civilizations have tried to identify their own discourse in time, and that is not in any way refutable. Our post-independence leaders and thinkers and theorists have borrowed heavily from the European scholarly canons and European frames of thought and analysis to try and first understand the place of Africa at the time they lived, but also to try and chart a way out of the exploitative kind of trenches that Africa had been locked into by colonialism and slavery and all of the other historical epochs that the continent was imposed upon. So I feel that, yes, it was a reality that we couldn't escape, given that, like we have discussed in previous episodes of this podcast, the post-independence generation of Africa, and especially the elites, had been schooled in this European canon. And so those were the tools they had at their disposal. But having looked at the past half century of Africa's intellectuals' attempts to define and chart African reality within the ambit of European scholarship, of which class is a major tool in that chest, one is tempted to conclude that perhaps class is not an accurate or useful analytical tool, at least not in the same way that it has been applied to industrial and post-industrial European society.
And again, when we talk of the application of class to industrial, European society, particularly at the height of capitalism, obviously that is the place where the Communist Manifesto comes in to say, society has evolved through different stages, and at the particular stage that we find ourselves, the fight is between the capitalists, right? The class of people that own the means of production, those who are the managers of industrial production that at that time was at scale, right? And then those who have no other option but to deploy their labor in the service of that, emergent, industrial formation in Europe. Obviously, the picture has gotten more complicated over time, right? Now you find a whole class of people who are not engaged at all in industrial production or any real production at all, but there's now a class of financiers, speculators of all sorts who are making a lot of money in the world without, some would argue, adding any substantial value, to the world economy as the earlier class of industrialists. But going back to what you were saying, so you have that then Marx and Co distilling society into those two, broad categories, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? And saying that, okay, if we trace society, it has always been a battle between, those who are oppressed and then those who are the oppressor class, right? So it has always been a relationship of oppression throughout history. Going back to what you then said, that it's not a very useful category for us. Is this why obviously we are not at the same level of development, right? We're not at the same level of our societies haven't taken the same path, as it were. We're not at the same position that our societies have, become, if you put stratified along those different, categories. But why are we throwing out the concept of class? When we throw out the concept of class, are we talking about an absence of, stratification in African society at present? Or are we suggesting that it's just the current European characterizations or Western characterizations of their own class that is not useful to us?
I would say pretty much the latter rather than the former
Mm,
assertion to be my own train of thought. There certainly exists layers within African society, and there are
mm,
hierarchies and strata, and these define power dynamics, they define resource distribution, redistribution, lack thereof, they decide who gets access to certain privileges and certain rights and who is excluded. But my broader issue would be about epistemological problematization, in the sense that many students of Africa today and the global South in
mm,
general, but Africa in particular, is unique even within the categorical context of the global South, like to think that Africa is just an infant version of Europe. It is
mm,
just Europe 200 years ago. And when you listen to
yeah.
our statesmen, you listen to academics, they always say, oh, this is what Singapore was 50 years ago. This is what medieval England was, 300 years ago. The Americans in 1800s were just at the same level as many African states today. Those kinds of analogies and kind of parallels being drawn. And yet, fundamentally, I feel that when one reads deeply and critically into, for example, Marx's own chronology of European society, right from communalism through slavery to feudalism, and then that graduating into primitive accumulation and capitalism, and then a more refined form of capitalism, and with the hope that it would then go into this communist utopia. One does not see any historical parallels with Africa's own evolution.
Mm,
You know, uh, Definitely no slavery in the context in which European slavery happened.
yeah.
No feudalism. African monarchy is always kind of linked or uh, described as a feudalist kind of formation, and yet it is very different. The kinds of
Mm,
rights, the kinds of authority, and the derivatives of the authority that monarchies in African contexts have completely different from the absolute monarchies of Europe, that
mm,
kind of precipitated their own revolutions in the 1700s. So I feel that the class analysis tool chest fails right from the get-go because it doesn't get the contextual epistemology right. It simply
mm,
takes a blueprint that worked in Europe and perhaps parts of Asia, and then tries to map it almost directly and uncritically onto
mm,
Africa, because Africa is assumed to be simplistic.
mm.
And I feel that is very deceptive.
Yeah. No, definitely there is, and you point this out well when you said there's, in a sense, our leaders, have definitely bought into that kind of modern thought, right? And that kind of sort of both teleological, if that is the word, um,
Mm.
understanding of history, that history follows a certain order, and that what we are seeking is to go in the direction that European society has gone I'm always reminded again by our president, who I think is the president of Uganda, that is, who I think is a very big embodiment of that heritage, right? When you read his book, Sowing the Mustard Seed, either Sowing the Mustard Seed or What is Africa's Problem, he suggests that, okay, we discussed the party last week. One of the reasons why we need to do away with tribe or ethnic groups as sites of political mobilization. Obviously, they're problematic in terms of how diverse they can be. But his suggestion is that we need to actually mature Ugandan society up to the level that our society, that we can now contest politics along class lines. And that was the initial justification that he used for saying we need to embrace a no-party system. That if throughout history we've had a situation whereby, as Mamdani, I think articulated in that book, Slow Poison, right, that tribes are colonial creations, right? That when ethnic groups become politicized, what results is tribe. So to say, okay, and then now you have the introduction, obviously, of different religions as well, along which Africans become, divided. So to say that if we don't want to mobilize along these, cleavages that can be quite charged, then we have one interest as society, right? And we can move towards that interest. But for me, what was interesting in what he asserts is that we need to reach a point eventually whereby we will contest politics along class lines, right? That means that we'll have a party that is for workers, we'll have a party that is for, the bourgeoisie. And there was a very interesting episode, or something interesting that happened during one of the Labor Day celebrations. I remember I believe the Secretary General of the NRM, he was trying to speak and then do some kind of analysis of like class analysis of Uganda. And then the president was in attendance. And then he says, okay, you are the chief worker of Uganda. We are all workers. We are all working class. And you are our leader at the head of the working class. And then when the president stands up to speak after him, he says, no. He says, what type of political education are you guys doing in the NRM? That he is an official. And then he calls out the Secretary General. And he's like, no, the Secretary, you need to be doing more work in political education, because how can you say that I'm a worker? I'm not part of the proletariat. He tells him, no, I know you're trying to ingratiate yourself to me. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to suck up to me. You're trying to ingratiate yourself, but I'm not a worker. Like, I'm a bourgeoisie proper. So then he tries to correct his characterization. He tries to then correct that characterization.
Just before you proceed, if I could interject with another similarly.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I just remember the president saying something just as hilarious at his father's funeral, Amos Kaguta, and he declared that with the death of his father, the last peasant in his family had died. So it's quite telling.
Yeah. No, he's very conscious about what those characterizations are, in his head. But but still, though, I think one of the reasons why people try and establish these conceptual categories for thinking about the different groups of people in societies, so as to locate a struggle. Obviously, we all believe that ultimately it's one country, it's one continent, if you extend the analysis at the continental level. But we all have the same goals, essentially, right? Everybody wants to see their life move forward. Everybody wants to, live better, have, a degree of freedom, assert their rights, in society, live in a dignified manner. But I think sometimes why people try and embrace such, simplified, simplistic, or even sometimes more complex notions is because we want to locate the struggle. We want to know who it is exactly that we are fighting against and what we are fighting for. Now, that has its own merits and, demerits, but I think that is sometimes why people are quick to then embrace that tool, and why, for example, even in the post-colonial period, we were quick to embrace, Marxist, Leninist tools of analysis, because to say we have these tools that have showed us what struggle is like, and we have a definite group that we are against, and that is the colonial, the foreign colonial class with all its local collaborators. And we as a people are trying to, assert our right, over this group of people. So it was easier. You read Cabral, and he talks about the two different phases of the African Revolution. That, you have that initial phase of then we win political independence, but then if we are fighting for freedom, the freedom is not just from foreign influence; it's also freedom internally. That means there are elements within our own populations that will seek to curtail our freedoms, and so now we need to distill who those elements are, right? But to bring this discussion back home, comrade, you've done a trip around the country, right? So you've had, I'm not sure how extensive that trip is. You can share with us more about how that went, which places you are able to visit. Uganda is definitely a very big country, and it can be quite, I've moved across, I think, all the regions as well, not as extensively district by district, but we managed to move through a bit of it. So what is, when you make such a trip, what are the impressions that you draw in terms of just the nature of society and the general characteristics of the people that we have in our country, that we can start to then draw certain categories? Yeah, they may not be in antagonism, and I think that was the basic underlying, not even as it wasn't the assumption, but the notion underlying the Communist Manifesto is that not only that we have class, but that these classes are always in what? In antagonism. That is, they have different interests. So that need not be the case in Uganda. But what are your impressions from just that trip and being around the country as well?
Yeah. First, I would say that the opportunity to move around the country and do so in a phase of life where I was politically conscious, I was historically aware, and was therefore going not simply to observe, but also to try and apply some of the theory in a practical context and see how the two were in sync or not, was quite useful for me in helping to understand rural Uganda better, and by some extension rural Africa, because I always find it fascinating when people say, "Oh, Africa is not a country," especially sub-Saharan Africa, and yet every time I see documentaries, every time I see news reports, every time I read, journalistic pieces about one African country or another, it's the same problems. It's the same kind of material presentation you see, whether it's cities or whether it's the countryside. And so, for me, I think what stood out were the similarities across the country. You have, of course, these highways that radiate from the capital city, Kampala, which would be the economic and political hub of the country. And then they go in every direction. And then as you move away from the capital along each of the highways, highway that goes to the east, from Kampala through Jinja, Iganga, you proceed. You can go to Mbale, go to Tororo. Or the highway that, say, starts in Kampala and then goes through Luwero and proceeds northwards, goes through Lango, Acholi, and then, at some point around Lango, you can take off a detour and go to West Nile. Or the same highway that could take you to the northeast, Karamoja, Moroto, we're using either the eastern route or the northern route. the same highway, you know, that kind of then connects us to either broader DRC or broader Congo, north east of DRC, and then South Sudan. So I saw in the east and the north many similarities, okay, that were distinct from the similarities that I saw in the south and west. When I went to, for example, Rakai, which you would say is distant south, close to the border with Tanzania, and when I went to Kasese, or when I went to Kanungu, Kabale, and Kisoro, which is southwest, deep southwest, the border with Rwanda, I also saw similarities that kind of were different. And the historical sense has always been that Uganda is a two-country nation, or it's a two-society country. You have the north and the east, which is, you know, you could say Nilotic in a way, Nilotic, and then the south, which is the south and the west, which is Bantu. And I am, you know, sad that I saw those differences, even if I were to divorce the ethnicities of the areas from their residents, I could still see that these were two distinct spaces and realities in terms of how big each of the towns was, how vibrant the towns were, the kind of energy, of economic energy, the kind of vibrancy of life, and the potential for prosperity that you saw. You know, the type of houses that you saw in the different locations. Even, you know, there's this whole sense that at least the elites of each region have had a chance to eat. Okay? At least the elites of each region have had the chance to eat. While predominantly the government is made up of Ugandans from the western section of the country, every region, at least because of this broad-based umbrella theory that the movement seems to have adopted early on, every region has had its elites at least get a share, maybe not in equal proportion, but someone has got something. And yet, you know, you go to certain parts of the country, especially in the east and the north, and you don't see even slight signs, you know, that people have had a share of the national cake, especially if you go into the deeper areas of the region. So for me, what stood out were those differences. There is a general sense of lack everywhere, even in parts of the West. But then if you compare Masaka and Mbarara, they are, you know, doing a lot better, you know, than places like Mbale, than places like Lira, than places like Arua, even Moroto. Moroto is, you know, it's a small town. There are some programs recently that have come in, like USMID. USMID, for example, is a World Bank funded infrastructure development program specifically for cities and major towns in Uganda. And it has helped to give a little bit of a facelift to each town, each of the major towns in the different parts of the country. But yet, even with USMID's implementation, it's usually the scale that shows you that one project like that cannot hide the huge structural inequalities that exist. Just driving into Mbarara, for example, will just immediately give you the sense that this place is prosperous. You know, you see so much private development, so much housing that is new and recent and ongoing and construction, and all of the value chains that develop around that in terms of new schools and private hospitals, and a lot of that is shiny that you see that you don't see anywhere else. Okay, that you don't see anywhere else. So yeah, those differences were there, but also there was, of course, a general increase in the lack of obvious conspicuous material wealth as one moves away from the capital, which I guess wasn't so surprising. Yeah, that would be my brief report.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely merit, to the enterprise of travel itself, right? And a perspective that I've always reflected on before we even, further this conversation on just trying to distill, what Ugandan society looks like. There's a perspective you shared once about how government should mandate young Ugandans to either grow up in other families or in other regions of the country. And to a very large extent, I support that initiative that carries a similar spirit, because there's a sense in which travel expands your mind. It's I think it's there are two ways that people always disabuse themselves of different biases, if I to call them that. And one is that it can be ideological. You just learn, right? And then you know what to do, right? And you can just follow along. But the other bit of it is experiential, right? That, okay, if you are born in a patch like I was, you then have to move around and see that, no, the world is actually much bigger than a patch, right? And then your mind is open. And for me, that was the journey, going from a patch, even through much of it was through education, going to Iganga, seeing that things are a bit similar, right? Obviously, now, as you mentioned, a patch, growing up there was a notable. Apache is a very small town. At least now now we have municipality status, which I don't think has made any substantial difference beyond the fact that we also benefited from those youth made funds, right? And there has now been a proper, facelift of the town that I grew up in. But much else, nothing has really changed. I remember that when I was growing up, so the size of the town, it was 2 blocks, right? We have a roundabout in the middle of the town, and then four sides of the road will stretch. 1 kilometer this side, another kilometer of tarmac roads that side, the other kilometer going to Kampala through the ferry. Then you have another kilometer of the tarmac. Actually, I don't think it reaches a kilometer. Going a couple of meters going the direction of Lira, right? So you find just four directions of tarmac roads, and the buildings. Then now, obviously, the signature commercial buildings, those ones, the ones with the shops at the front, and then a couple of rooms and houses at the back, dot the streets or bestraddle the streets on the 2 sides of the road. And that nucleus, with the roundabout at its center, is now what is our town and urban center. And obviously there was very little that is happening by way of life, and you see that there is a very in terms, obviously for me, I loved it for the peace of it all. I don't think that urbanization generally is a sign of progress, but you can see certain indicators, right, of what that is. Youth meet has been helpful, and I think traveling, living that reality of then going to Busoga and studying in Busoga, right? Obviously it helps you in disabusing you of any tribalist notions that might have been injected even subconsciously by just the society that is you've grown up in, or then later on going to the central region to be educated at one of the institutions that drew a lot of people from all over the country. So just that alone, right, is very helpful, and I think that perspective is good. And then the travel, within the continent, outside the continent. It helps open you up. So going back to what you're saying, that in a sense, there's a sense in which Africa is a country, right? And normally this argument is made that the reason why in Marxist analysis, right, the reason why workers normally struggle is because workers are many, right? And so it's harder for them to mobilize themselves around a shared agenda. It's very easy for other parties to have incursions into the working class, because there are many. But capitalists by nature, the dominant classes are few in number, so they can easily coordinate among themselves and around their interests, right? But whereas in Africa, you find, fights between, for example, the peasantry in Uganda and the peasantry in Tanzania. And yet the guys who are running the economies, they're very coordinated. You look at this even in the sense in which we advocate for initiatives like the integration of the African continent, right? Having shared infrastructure, having open air spaces, that there's a sense in which such an agenda obviously is fronted by people who see its usefulness, which tends to be our, commercial classes in society. But I love that
If I
perspective
could
that,
just interject
yeah,
briefly, Olemo.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I
please.
feel that right there is where I think the bone of contention is on whether
Mm,
class analysis as a tool is actually relevant for African society,
mm,
because the argument that you make for workers being many and therefore prone to disunity, and capitalists or bourgeoisie being few and therefore easy to mobilize, easy to have their vested interests synchronized, applies almost perfectly to European society and to some extent Asian society. I feel
yeah,
like in the African context, it falls flat on its face.
mm,
You have given a very relevant example of airspace, ease of doing borders across, of doing business across borders, the concept of the common market, and this commonwealth capitalists in Africa can take advantage of. And yet, very few African capitalists, even in the modern age, have been able to take advantage of this. Dangote Aliko, who is Africa's richest man, a few months ago, and this is on record,
yeah,
was complaining, I think somewhere at some summit, that he needed 18 visas to go across the country,
yeah,
to go across the continent, to go from one country. He is Africa's richest man, and yet we lack the infrastructure to allow him to move his capital seamlessly from one jurisdiction to another. Similarly, a few months ago, Alfred Mutua, I think, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister of Kenya or something now, he was formerly Speaker of the Kenyan Parliament. He was also, caught on camera complaining to some gathering of African leaders about how the European Union and, the global North is deliberately keeping African borders up and well. And I think this is why I applaud a few of the countries like Kenya and Rwanda who have now adopted no visa policies for all African citizens. But they are still too few and far between. But he was complaining and saying, these guys are keeping us deliberately divided while they are doing business easily across the EU. So if even at that level, at that top level of state governance and commercial operation, you still have Africa's versions of what would be the bourgeoisie and the ruling class really complaining and feeling powerless in their ability to mobilize resources and at scale and across the continent. Then I think that is where now the problem of class analysis as inapplicable to Africa actually makes sense, because I feel that even those that we consider as holding the means of production and access to power in Africa don't What we have is an entire continent that is completely proletarized, if I may use the term.
Yeah.
Even our presidents, even the people that are supposed to hold the commanding heights of the economy are not allowed. For example, the presidents that were not allowed to fly into Libya and broker a peace deal with Gaddafi, and they were complaining.
The president has always made it a point to remind us of what happens.
That the plane was told to turn around, otherwise it would be shot. So yeah, I rest my case.
Yeah. So no, definitely that's very important, because in trying to establish some kind of neat delineation of sort of class in Uganda, or at least in Africa, it's very easy to then, let's say, contrast what we would have as a bourgeoisie, right? The class of the Dangote, the Hamis Chigundus in Uganda, the what's the name of this man in South Africa of FUFA? Sorry, not FUFA, FIFA. The owner of Sundowns.
No, I forget the name.
I remember his name, but let's just talk of that class of people, the Oppenheimers in South Africa. So that obviously we have different levels of wealth and productivity as well, right? So it's easy to talk about those people. And then
Patrice Motsepe, that's what the internet says.
Yes, Patrice Motsepe, yes. So the Patrice Motsepe is our man with the awards for African president, Mo Ibrahim. It's very easy to identify these business elite. And obviously in Uganda you also have the Asians, right? Families like the Metas, and the Ruparera family as well. All these people, and to say, okay, these are our bourgeoisies, this is our capitalist class in the proper sense. But even that itself would be a bit incomplete as an analysis, because there's that sense of alliance with foreign capital, either an alliance or the subordination of that class of domestic capital to the interest of foreign capital.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think you point that out when you say that, okay, we still have not escaped the reality that we are at the periphery of the global economy, right? And being at the periphery of the global economy means that there is an international division of labor. There's an international division of work and labor that has happened, and so countries like Uganda have very particular contributions that they can make to the global system. And so that also the nature of the work that our domestic capitalist class and bourgeoisie can undertake, is very different from what the bourgeoisie, for example, in Europe would be doing. Chiefly, of course, they would be engaged in, industrial production, processing, and all of these things. But because of the level of development that we have, as Fanon says that, our national bourgeoisie, our national middle class, what they are normally in charge of is that they have been conciled to the role of an intermediary, and
absolutely,
and
they're just
it's a very funny
middlemen,
and traders, and a word that the president loves so much, compradors. That our national, bourgeoisie, they're not a very productive class, in the sense of you don't have a lot of people who are establishing large factories, for example, in Uganda, that are, that can rival, the companies that are making, Calvin Klein clothes, for example, companies that are making, phones, and from day one. And that's just because they don't have the capacity, right? And we've not been able to, up to this point, empower them as much. So you find that most of them are then confined to trade, activities of the intermediary type rather. And then the other big industry, obviously, that our commercial, class is engaged with, what we would in that kind of analysis call our, our commercial oligarchy, our bourgeoisie, is tourism, right? So trade, tourism. So Fanon is very funny when he says that, what has happened in the global south or the developing world is that now we've become the brothels of Europe, right? Whatever, we become the entertainers of everybody else. That our national middle class serves the interests of Europeans in that real sense. That anything that the entertainment that they need to come and do game hunting, tourism, and all of these things. They're the ones who entertain that. To attract a few dollars here and there. So I think that analysis definitely is more complex at that level about how productive actually our national bourgeoisie is, but also with just the emergence of the age of neoliberalism that we exist in, the borders that we had to open, the privatization that had to happen with the in the late 80s and 90s. You also now have the confluence of foreign capital as well. In countries like the US, they can get to say things like, no, we're not going to allow this and this company to come and compete,
Yeah.
right? But it seems that option was always taken away from us. So even most of the corporations that we have, in the country, it's really, they're really just junior partners of foreign capital, right? We're not,
Yeah.
it's not a national company, for example, that's drilling our oil. The biggest banks in Uganda most of them are of foreign origin. I don't remember the story of Crane Bank, but I know that was a Sudir Bank. You look Stanbic Bank. It's it comes from outside the continent. Standard Chartered, ABSA, DFC, all of these, most of these entities, right, are not local
Yeah.
to the country. Look at our biggest telecommunications companies. Up to now, we've never been able to evolve a national company that deals telecommunications, right? Even the
Yeah.
large scale commercial agriculture that we have, obviously much of that is within the people of Asian descent, in Uganda, the Madivanis, the Metas, the Aga Khans, and the ventures that are linked with, and the farms that that they rely on. But most of them still are subordinated in a sense to international capital. But
Absolutely.
obviously, because of the regulations that we have, they're able to benefit immensely from the state. So, but going back to rural life, just going back there, within these rural communities, or within these communities that are up country, were you able to sort of have a sense in which those societies are distilled? What are the different sectors in those societies, and what are the interests that are attached to them?
Mm.
For
I would
example,
say
when
that
you went to Rakai, you went to Tororo, you went to Lira. So up country, what is happening? What are people's interests? Who are
yeah, I think that one of the major phenomena I was able to observe was this slow, pernicious, but very effective transfer of wealth from peasants to an emerging kind of crony capitalist class. Okay.
mm,
And
mm,
and the way this is happening is through the very effective operation of neoliberal policies. I'm not sure if this was directly intended, because that would be very wicked, or it is just one of those unforeseen side
mm,
effects of
mm,
neoliberalism and structural adjustment. Because what
mm.
happened was, once you privatize public goods,
Yeah.
especially essential public goods like education, good education, quality education, as well as public health care. Of
Mm,
course, we have public hospitals and public schools at primary and secondary
mm,
level, but these are just shells of institutions. They don't deliver any meaningful service to the population. So what happens is that even peasants who, for example, might be uneducated, understand the value
the value.
of education.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that I did not understand was a historical aspect in Ugandan society until I listened to Dr.
Comrade, you're muted. You're muted. You're muted. The last thing we had was the
Yes,
doctor
sorry.
that you.
Yeah. So, and this was not something I understood about Ugandan society until I listened to Dr. Apollo Milton's Obote's speech in 1982, I think in Gulu at one of the national rallies that were held there. And he said, I know you people of Uganda love education more than you love your lives. And he was giving an example of how his government had invested largely in public quality education all across the country. These government schools that were established, right, from the first Obote government. And that was also a priority of his second government, though, because of the war, many of those promises were never eventually fulfilled. But the importance of education in the Ugandan imagination, send a child to school, that child, is going to get a quality education and then break free of this vicious cycle of poverty. And that
it's a long-term investment.
Yes, it's a long-term investment. And that is now something that once neoliberal policies were implemented in the 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, you now had a catch-22 situation where peasants who are not part of the money economy, they did not benefit from this divestment. They did not buy any new companies. They did not have the skills to now sell their labor into these newly privatized farms and therefore get wage labor. All they had in terms of wealth is cattle, is land, is agricultural products in the form of grain or crops or whatever they could sell. Now, of course, the neoliberal reforms means that a money economy, a bigger economic output leads to inflation, supply-driven inflation. And so now to be able to buy the same basket of goods or get a child to attain quality education or send a sick relative to the hospital, you now needed more money. You needed to pay the private capitalist that had bought the previous government hospital or set up this new shiny private school that outcompeted all the government schools, right? So that means peasants now have to sell their land, they have to sell their cattle, they have to sell the assets they had in order to acquire the same basket of goods that they previously were able to get freely from the government, or at least heavily subsidized. So now, as the generations progress, the peasants now own less and less wealth, okay? Because they've sent the children to school, the children are now expected to get into a money economy, having acquired skills, university education. But then because the economy is not growing fast enough, okay, the children are not able to earn that money back quickly. And so now the concept of black tax comes into the picture. Again, tying us back to this whole class analysis, okay? So this university educated son has responsibility for his peasant parents, completely peasant. And yet he was made by them, okay? In the sense that they had to completely mortgage their wealth, sell it off in order to earn him this class graduation, from peasantry to an educated potential member of the proletariat.
Of the middle class,
Exactly. And so now, because he's unable to earn that money back and send it back, or even if best case scenario, he gets a job somewhere in a private company in Kampala, MTN or whatever, and he's earning 1 million, 2 million, he now has to pay fees for all his siblings. He has to build his parents a house. He has to try and buy back that piece of land, that was sold. Send him to university. Definitely is not going to have any time to build savings at an individual level and make investments that are then going to, make sure that he has passive income that makes him part of the bourgeoisie eventually. So you now have this vicious cycle.
Cycle, yeah.
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 You have a vicious cycle
Yeah.
emerging there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
that
think
is something I've
because
noticed across the country, that net transfer of wealth from peasants, should I call it lumpen bourgeoisie? Lumpen bourgeoisie crony capitalist class.
I mean,
Yeah.
because
Because
most of them, yeah.
go ahead. No, that's it.
I mean, because most of these people, I think that wealth transfer concept is very important because most of the wealth tends to be, most of the proprietors of these institutions is private. And I think the school, Comrade, I love the fact that you brought the school, because I think the school is it's sort of the biggest indicator of, if you want to sort of understand where people are coming from in Ugandan society, the school is that site that you want to look at. Obviously, one, because you pointed out that, Ugandans, and I think this might inhere across the continent, love education, right? Because we don't see any other possibility. It's not like we are supporting our children's talents. You can go and play football, you can go and play the violin, and become a very a wild phenomenon. No, you can go and play chess and build a career off of that. So the avenue that most of us see, and in all classes of society, towards the ability to accumulate is education, right? Build your skills, add value to yourself, and then you can be able to find a certain position, either within government, within the civil service, which in Uganda, the government is our biggest employer, or within all these multinational companies that are coming up, the banking industry, telecommunications, all these other companies that are coming up as well in the financial services as well, right? So education is the best bet, or, again, if you become a doctor, either a government hospital or another private hospital. But most of the proprietors of these services tend to then form that class that we're talking about, right? That they come from either that middle class, or they come from, they're really high, you think of them as some kind of, people have hinted at the existence of an oligarchy that is kind of tied to the political class, because somehow also the most rewarding enterprise on the African continent, very unfortunately, tends to be the politics, right?
Yep.
And so a lot of people, a lot of people tend to be people that are tied to this class. So because when you are connected to the politicians, and obviously there are a lot of rents to collect, right?
Yeah.
Tenders, contracts, and all of that. And then you guys have access to taxpayers' money as well, and all of this money that you're getting from abroad. So then there's that transfer, I think. So when you go to the school, you then know who is who. You know who is coming from where. I remember when I was in primary school, at our school, they never allowed students to bring grub, right? At least that's what they told us initially. You cannot bring any food from outside. It was a boarding school, but you could not bring any food from home. But I remember seeing then the child of a very prominent, politician, I think top 4 in the country. I remember there was a whole convoy that came into the school, and then the most shocking thing happened. I remember a bunch of people, I believe there must have been police officers, they were picking food, grab all these snacks and all these assortments of different things, and ferrying them into the office of the head teacher. So, and I'm like, not only have we been banned from being able to bring anything that our parents may want to give us, but you have this situation where there's this person who has this kind of access doing this. So I think the school is a very good site, but also the concept of accumulation as well, that then the peasantry, which tends to be the dominant, in terms of number, preponderance class in our societies, there's that transfer of, just like what happens at a national level, that because we are buying things that we don't make, a lot of wealth is leaving, the country to go to the global north. So I think that the school is a very good unit of analysis, just like the private hospital as well, because a lot of expenditure in Uganda, health expenditure, is out of pocket. And a lot of people typically will pay a lot for their health care, right? But because and yeah, credit to the healthcare system, it's a good system. The thinking behind it is good, that let's decentralize healthcare provision as much as possible. Because of the quality challenges, you now see a lot of extraction, you see a lot of wealth then leaving families to go to, you know, the owners of these establishments that are elsewhere. So I think that is a very good unit of analysis. As we close maybe for today, um how do we, I want us, we've spoken about rural life, right, and what is happening up country, what's happening in these, you know, upstarts of modern, of urban areas, you know, in some of these areas. But what of our, you know, how do we characterize the dominant, you know, classes in society? Who are the people that you would say are the ones that, when you listen to people like, you know, the current flag bearer for the National Unity Platform speak, you know, they speak of this class of people that have forestalled the progress of the entire society. How do we characterize that class, the class that is the dominant one in society? And this is like internal among us.
The class that has reaped the fruits and rewards of patronage.
Yes.
That's what I would call it, you know, crony capitalists. Crony capitalists that haven't built any industries, that haven't invested in any agribusiness, in any value addition at any point. You know, we are still exporting the same raw coffee bean today that we did in 1962. You know, that is the class of capitalists that has emerged from the divestiture of the national heirloom, you know, that the NRM government literally sold for a song in 1990. I was listening to a podcast by Charles Onyango Obo a few days ago, and he said, you know, our structural adjustment embrace and the way we implemented it was the most aggressive in the whole world. It was so insensitive, you know, to the victims, and so thorough and complete that it just hollowed out the economic soul of the country and turned it on its head completely. Huge retrenchments of civil servants, a devaluation of the shilling that just completely eviscerated people's savings overnight. You know, just complete farming out of public services, from electricity to health to education, you know, and just left the public at the mercy of the market. And has been, you know, very, very difficult recovery from that point onwards. And of course, except the multinationals that cashed in at the time and, you know, bought up the banks and bought up many of the other nascent industries that we had, and their local compradors, local middlemen. Other significant beneficiary was the immediate circle of the presidential palace, you know, the family of presidents, close friends, close associates, Bush War veterans, and that kind of class.
The historicals, yeah?
Yes, the historicals. So there was, you know, clear favoritism, clear cronyism in the kind of people that became overnight millionaires. And of course, I think the one class that survived intact was the landed gentry in Uganda. And I've, you know, recently concluded Mamdani's Slow Poison, and this is something that he highlights, you know, and how each successive post-independence government had to negotiate with them somehow, because they were the most organized, and their ability to coalesce power, to fund opposition, and is something that has both worked for and against each incumbent. And I think that people like Chirumira, people like Ham, have very close connections to that landed gentry, and especially the elites and the nobility around the Kabakaship and Mengo as political economic establishment also form part of that class. Yeah.
So I think definitely there is that alliance. It's sort of like a political, military, commercial oligarchy of sorts, right? You're close, part of the political class, so it gives you, access to all these contracts, part of the divestment. You get, these guys had their hands in the parastatals. I think there was a whole controversy around the president's brother at that point, if you recall, around certain banks, certain organizations, and even now there are a lot of infrastructure projects around the country, and you try and trace the companies that are doing this work, and you can easily know, the alliances that they have. I think that the last thing maybe we'll just comment on is because we've talked about rural life, talked about the dominant class, which has political military backing, that informs the economic power that they have. The last bit, would there be a middle layer that people have called the middle class? How significant is the middle class? What are these people's interests? What sets them apart, for example, from the peasantry, and then this dominant class that is able to send their kids abroad, to study and to access all kinds of welfare?
Yeah, I would say my assessment of the middle class is that they are suffering from an identity crisis now. They may be diagnosed as going through social schizophrenia, collective schizophrenia, because on the one hand, they are aspirational. They want all of the trappings and amenities of bourgeois lifestyle. They want to live in high-end apartments. They want to drive European-made cars. They look down on Japanese cars and turn their noses up at, all kinds of brands that are not considered as reflective of a higher class and finer living. And they ape and parrot the West, and mannerisms, but they are still very intimately tied to the village, as people would say. There is no single Ugandan living today who has no ties to the village. They still need to go home for Christmas. They are still not buried in a cemetery in Kampala. They still they have to be transported back. To lie beside their great grandfather. That is if the land has not been grabbed by a military general yet. But they are in that kind of vacuum, that state of suspense, where they have the exposure, they have the conceptual outlook, they have the desires and aspirations of a legitimate upper proletariat that could easily become bourgeoisie if, for example, they got access to stock market, for example, and were able to now to buy shares like their counterparts in the West, buy shares in these big conglomerates and companies that are manufacturing arms and weapons and all kinds of things. You can no longer claim to be part of the proletariat after that when you're getting dividends, Donald Duck, every month. But so they aspire to those things. They're now buying bonds and investing in all kinds of finance that turn them from victim to victimizer. the concept that I mentioned earlier of black tax. And many of them, are now starting to rail against it and even kind of justifying what for me is an abnegation of responsibility, saying,
Mm.
oh no, I need to cut off, my extended family.
My family.
They stop picking up
I
calls,
think I think that I mean it makes sense. I mean we because
Yeah,
of how westernized people are
yeah,
becoming, there's now
yeah,
that intensity of a focus towards the nuclear family. That no, the
exactly.
extended family is a fetter towards my
Mm.
own personal and individual progress. So
Yeah,
the
exactly.
clan has now moved. When you go to the urban area, there's no concept of the clan anymore. There's no concept of
People no
the
longer go home for Christmas, People no longer pick
because
up,
because they know
uncles.
that when you go for Christmas, there'll be begging balls that will be
Exactly,
presented towards you. Mm,
exactly. And yet, I do not think that that is the Africa we want.
yes.
In Europe, people spend years without speaking to their parents. They
As
throw them away in
as,
old people's homes
as
and
having a
just
yeah,
abandon. That is
as
not the kind of Africa I want to build.
definitely not. I was having a class. There's a professor who taught me, very good man, and
Mm,
he was lecture. I was very surprised because when we were in uni and he was lecturing and he was telling this class that is predominantly full of American students,
yeah.
and he was saying to them, see, because he had been to Uganda, so he was
Mm,
saying I was in Uganda and there's all these extended family networks and there's all these old people who are living together and these young
yeah.
people are there supporting them. Then he was telling us, I haven't heard he was like 80 something. I was like, I've not heard from my daughters and my sons for like the longest time possible. And I'm just like, this is just so sad. This is a very good man. He's very sweet, but
Yeah.
where's that network? So and
Mm,
obviously the problem now is that the national middle class as well has some kind of cultural hegemony, right?
mm,
Because of their economic power in society, they can easily, influence the culture that then gets to, spread around the entire society. So it remains to be seen, what their fate will be. But I think beyond, as we close, beyond the ties that they, as you say, in the identity crisis, beyond the ties that they're trying to navigate, with where they come from. I think also there is this pragmatism that they're forced into. If you're part of the middle class, you want the country to continue running along meritocratic lines. You want to embrace these Western models, but at the same time, you have a keen appreciation of what political stability is going to do for you. Right. So I think there's also that conflict that, okay, we want a Western style democracies in the country. We want a country that's running very well along the lines of rule of law, meritocracy, people are not, collecting rent from government based on political and familial ties. It's not nepotism, that's the order of the day. But at the same time, there's a sense in which because of your economic investment, you want a sense of stability, political and economic. Right. So you want things to change, but at the same time, you're skeptical about that change. So you're almost, caught up in there's almost like a stasis of sorts, that makes it very hard for you to fight for anything revolutionary in the country at large. So, comrade, I don't know if you have any other comments. Definitely, we'll keep extending this analysis as we progress with the ideological college, but I don't know if there's any, closing comments on just the class character and outlook of our, societies.
just say that I think this was a very good conversation, and I look forward to future discourses.
All right, thank you very much, and we are glad for everyone that could join us today. We'll continue with the Fourth Generation Initiative with the Ideological College series as well. And as always, we covet your engagement throughout all our platforms. All right, see you next time. Bye.